I hid in the back of a black luxury sedan to escape my abusive ex, Fermin. I didn't know the man sitting in the shadows was Seung-Ho Lee, the most feared mafia boss in the city. I only knew that if Fermin caught me, I wouldn't just be bruised this time. He was going to trade me to the Iron Lotus Syndicate to settle his gambling debts. I looked down at the yellowing marks on my forearm. They were a map of Fermin's rage, left there 3 days ago just because I'd forgotten to lock the front door. For 5 years, my life was a calculated navigation of eggshells. I made myself small. I stopped speaking above a whisper. I stayed because Fermin convinced me that no one else would ever want a woman like me. Someone he said took up too much space. Someone he used his words to crush until I felt like nothing. I stayed until this morning. That was when I found the burner phone taped to the underside of the bathroom sink. The texts weren't about love or jealousy anymore. They were about a price tag. My price tag. The terror finally overrode the conditioning. I ran with nothing but the clothes on my back. But I only made it 3 blocks before I heard the roar of Fermin's Camaro echoing against the concrete walls of the parking garage. The sedan door was unlocked. I dove in, pressing my body against the floorboards, praying the tinted glass would hide me. Then, a cold, calm voice came from the seat above me. "You're in the wrong car, little bird." I looked up into the dark eyes of Seung-Ho Lee, and for the first time in years, I wasn't just afraid. I was chosen. The heavy door of the sedan thudded shut, sealing me into a world of leather and silence. Outside, the garage floor vibrated with the roar of Fermin's Camaro. I pressed my cheek against the cold, plush floorboards, my heart hammering so hard I thought it would shatter my ribs. Through the dark tint of the windows, I saw Fermin's silhouette, a jagged shadow of the man who had owned my fear for 5 years. He was pacing, his fists clenched, screaming my name with a feral desperation that made me curl into a tighter ball. "Lori, I know you're here, you worthless brat." I squeezed my eyes shut, praying to a god I hadn't spoken to in years that the owner of this car wouldn't return until Fermin gave up. I was a trespasser, a thief of space, hiding in a vehicle that probably cost more than the apartment Fermin had kept me prisoner in. My fingers dug into the carpet, my yellowing bruises throbbing in rhythm with my pulse. I waited for the glass to shatter, for Fermin to drag me out by my hair and finalize the deal he'd made on that burner phone. Then, the air in the car shifted. It didn't just get colder. It became heavy, charged with a sudden, suffocating authority. "You're making a lot of noise for someone trying to stay hidden." The voice didn't come from outside. It came from the darkness of the rear seat, just inches from my head. I froze, my breath hitching in my throat. I hadn't even realized someone was already inside. I looked up, my eyes wide and stinging with unshed tears, and met a pair of eyes that were as calm and predatory as a deep-sea trench. Seung-Ho Lee sat perfectly still, a tablet glowing dimly in his lap, casting sharp, angular shadows across his high cheekbones. He didn't look startled. He looked mildly inconvenienced, like a god interrupted by a stray cat. Outside, Fermin slammed his fist against the car's rear pillar. The metal let out a dull groan. "I'm gonna find you, Lori. And when I do, you're gonna wish you never ran." I let out a broken, jagged sob, my hands flying to cover my mouth. I expected the man in the suit to kick me out, to open the door and hand me over to the monster just to stop the noise. Instead, Seung-Ho leaned forward. The scent of expensive cologne and ozone filled my senses as he reached out. He didn't grab me. He simply placed a single, steady hand on the upholstery next to my trembling shoulder. "He is the one hunting you?" Seung-Ho asked, his voice a low, melodic vibration that seemed to anchor me to the floor. I nodded frantically, unable to find my voice. Seung-Ho glanced at the window where Fermin's distorted face was pressed against the glass, oblivious to the dragon staring back at him. A ghost of a smile touched Seung-Ho's lips, not out of kindness, but out of a dark, possessive amusement. He reached for the intercom to the driver. "Drive," he commanded. "And if he stays in the way, don't tap the brakes." As the car began to glide forward with a predatory smoothness, Seung-Ho looked down at me, his gaze lingering on the bruise on my arm. He leaned closer, his shadow swallowing me whole. "Stay down, Lori," he whispered, the promise of safety sounding more dangerous than the threat I was fleeing. "I'll protect you." The car glided through the city like a silent predator, the neon lights of Seoul blurring into long, jagged streaks of violet and gold against the tinted glass. I remained on the floorboards, my cheek pressed against the carpet, even as the roar of Fermin's Camaro faded into the distance. I was terrified to move, terrified to occupy the space Seung-Ho Lee had seemingly granted me. Every time the car turned, I felt the weight of his gaze on the back of my neck, a physical pressure that felt heavier than Fermin's hands. We didn't stop at a police station or a hospital. Instead, the sedan descended into a private subterranean garage that looked more like a vault than a parking structure. When the engine finally died, the silence was absolute. The door was opened from the outside by a man in a sharp, slate-gray suit who didn't blink at the sight of a disheveled, bruised woman trembling at his boss's feet. "Get up," Seung-Ho said. It wasn't a request, but it wasn't a threat either. It was a fact. I climbed out on shaky legs, clutching my thin sweater around my chest. We moved toward a private elevator that ascended with a sickening speed, depositing us directly into a penthouse that defied everything I knew about the world. It was a cathedral of glass and cold marble, perched so high above the city that the cars below looked like glowing embers. The air here smelled of expensive cedar and something metallic, like a sharpened blade. A group of men stood in the foyer, bowing in perfect unison as Seung-Ho entered. Among them was a man with sharp, fox-like eyes and a clinical expression, Director Min. He looked at me not with pity, but with the calculated coldness one might reserve for a suspicious package. "Who is she, boss?" Min asked, his voice cutting through the silence. "The Iron Lotus is already asking about the debt Fermin Devers owes. Taking his woman complicates the ledger." Seung-Ho stripped off his leather gloves, tossing them onto a marble console. He turned to look at me, his eyes scanning the yellowing bruises on my arms and the way I tried to make myself invisible. "She isn't his woman anymore," Seung-Ho stated, his voice echoing off the high ceilings. He walked toward me until he was close enough that I could feel the heat radiating from his suit. He reached out, his thumb tracing the line of my jaw with a terrifying gentleness. "From this moment, she is a guest of this house. Treat her as safe, but do not forget who she belongs to." He looked over his shoulder at Min, his expression hardening into something ancient and immovable. "She is property of the Lee estate now. If a single hair on her head is harmed, I will consider it a personal theft against me." I shivered, the word property sinking into my skin like ice. I had escaped one cage only to find myself in a gilded fortress, and as Seung-Ho turned away, leaving me in the care of his silent, watchful guards, I realized the dragon didn't just save me, he had claimed me. The next evening, the penthouse was a cathedral of shadows, lit only by the amber glow of the city skyline through the floor-to-ceiling glass. I had spent the day tucked into a corner of the guest suite, trying to be as silent as the furniture. When a maid arrived to tell me that Seung-Ho expected me for dinner, my stomach did a painful somersault. For Fermin, dinner had been a minefield. A misplaced fork or a slightly overcooked steak was enough to trigger a weekend of silence or worse. The dining table was a massive slab of obsidian black wood, set with heavy silverware that caught the light like polished bone. Seung-Ho sat at the head, his suit jacket discarded, His white shirt sleeves rolled up to reveal forearms that looked like they were carved from granite. He didn't look up as I slid into a chair at the far end of the table, as far away from him as I could possibly get. "Move," he said, his voice a low vibration that seemed to rattle the crystal glasses. I froze, my hands hovering over my lap.
I'm sorry.
Am I in the wrong seat? "You are sitting in the next zip code, Lori," he said, finally looking up. His dark eyes were unreadable. "Sit to my right. Now." I scurried to the chair beside him, my heart racing. A chef appeared, placing a plate in front of me that looked like a work of art. Seared of 5 wagyu, delicate greens, and rich sauces. The smell was intoxicating, but my throat was a tight knot of reflex. I picked up my fork and began to push the food around, meticulously cutting a piece of beef into tiny, microscopic slivers. I was practicing the art of the ghost, eating enough to survive, but not enough to be noticed. "Why aren't you eating?" I whispered, not meeting his eyes. "I'm just not very hungry." Suddenly, Seung-Ho's hand shot out, his fingers closing firmly but not painfully over my wrist. He forced me to drop the fork. The metal clattered against the porcelain with a sound like a gunshot. "Fermin told you that you were too much," Seung-Ho said, his voice dropping into a dangerous, gravelly register. "He told you that you took up too much space, that your needs were a burden. He used your hunger to make you small so he could feel tall." I felt a tear prick the corner of my eye. The accuracy of his words felt like a physical blow. "In this house," he continued, leaning so close I could see the golden flecks in his irises, "hunger is not a weakness. It is a right. To refuse this food is to insult my ability to provide for what is mine." He picked up the fork and pressed it back into my hand, his palm warm against my skin. "Eat, Lori. Take up the space. Breathe as loud as you want. I didn't bring a shadow into my home. I brought a woman. Start acting like one." Under the weight of his command and his protection, I took a real bite. The richness of the food was overwhelming, a sharp contrast to the years of starvation and eggshells. For the first time, I wasn't just fueling a victim. I was feeding a survivor. The next morning, the gilded cage felt a little smaller. Seung-Ho had decided I needed a wardrobe that reflected my new status as his guest, though my reflection in the mirror still looked like a ghost. We arrived at a high-end boutique in the city's most exclusive district, a place of white marble, minimalist racks, an air that smelled of champagne and judgment. As soon as we stepped inside, the head sales clerk, a woman with a face like a sharpened blade, swept her gaze over me. She saw my oversized sweater, my frayed jeans, and the faint, yellowing shadow of the bruise on my neck that the concealer couldn't quite hide. She didn't see a person. She saw a stain on her pristine floor. "I'm afraid we are fully booked for private appointments today," she said, her voice dripping with practiced condescension. She looked at Seung-Ho, her eyes widening as she recognized his tailored suit. But then she looked back at me and sneered. "And we don't carry sizes for more substantial frames. Perhaps there is a department store nearby that would be more suitable for her." The air in the room didn't just chill. It died. I felt that familiar, sickening urge to apologize, to shrink until I disappeared. I took a step back, my head dropping, the old conditioning telling me she was right, that I didn't belong here. But Seung-Ho didn't move. He stood like a pillar of smoke and steel. He didn't raise his voice, which made it 10 times more terrifying. "What is your name?" he asked quietly. "It's Celine, sir," she stammered, her confidence beginning to fracture under the weight of his stare. "Well, Celine," Seung-Ho said, stepping closer to her, "you have made a grave mistake. You didn't just insult a customer. You insulted my taste. You suggested that what I choose to keep near me is inferior." He turned his head slightly, and Director Min appeared at the door like a silent shadow. Min, call the owner of this building. Tell them I am buying this boutique. Not the clothes, the business, the lease, everything. The clerk's face went the color of curdled milk. Sir, I didn't mean. And when the paperwork is signed, Seung-Ho continued, his voice as smooth as silk, your first and only task as the new owner's representative, Min, is to fire this woman. She is never to work in this district again. He turned back to me, reaching out to lift my chin so I was forced to meet his eyes. Lori, look at me. Seung-Ho walked toward me, his presence filling the library until the walls felt like they were closing in. He didn't deny it. He leaned over the desk, pinning me with a gaze that was both possessive and painfully honest. Fermin was going to sell you to a brothel in Macau to clear his books, he said, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous growl. The Iron Lotus doesn't negotiate with victims. I didn't buy a piece of property, Lori. I bought your life so they couldn't take it. He reached out, his fingers brushing the hair back from my forehead. The car door was unlocked because I was waiting for you. I chose to own the debt so no one else could ever claim to own you. I looked at the ledger and then at the dragon standing over me. The cage was still gilded, and I was still property. But for the first time, I realized the price of my freedom had been paid in blood and black ink by the only man Fermin feared. The library felt like a tomb after Seung-Ho left. The revelation of the debt ledger was a weight I couldn't shake, a cold reminder that even in this paradise of marble and silk, I was a commodity that had merely changed hands. I was staring out at the rain-streaked windows when the door opened. It wasn't Seung-Ho's heavy, purposeful stride. These footsteps were light, precise, and dangerous. Director Min entered, his face an impenetrable mask of bureaucratic coldness. He didn't look at the books or the view. He looked at me as if I were a smudge on a pristine lens. He walked to the desk and tapped the ledger I had just closed. I see you found the receipt for your life, Min said, his voice a dry hiss that set my nerves on edge. He saved me, I said, though it sounded more like a question than a statement. Min let out a short, mirthless laugh. He stepped closer, leaning into my personal space until I could see the flick of his eyes scanning my face for weakness. Save? You've lived with a man like Fermin for 5 years, Lori. You should know that men like Seung-Ho Lee don't spend millions on charity. They spend it on investments. I shook my head, my heart beginning its frantic, familiar rhythm. He told me I was safe here. Safe? You are bait, Min whispered, the words hitting me like a physical blow. The Iron Lotus is a hornet's nest, and Seung-Ho just kicked it by taking you. He didn't buy your debt to set you free. He bought it to lure Chairman Vong out into the open. As long as you are under this roof, the Iron Lotus will come for you. And when they do, Seung-Ho will be waiting with a gun in his hand. You aren't his guest, Lori. You're the cheese in the trap. The air in the room suddenly felt thin. Every touch, every meal, every word Seung-Ho had spoken. Was it all just to make the bait more enticing? To make me believe I was worth protecting so I wouldn't run before the trap was sprung? My vision blurred as the walls of the gilded fortress seemed to transform back into the basement apartment I had fled. You're lying? I choked out, but the conviction in my voice was gone. Before Min could respond, a low, pulsing thrum vibrated through the floorboards. It wasn't the wind. A split second later, the sharp, rhythmic wail of the penthouse security alarm tore through the silence. The red emergency lights flickered on, casting the library in the color of fresh blood. Min's expression shifted instantly from mockery to cold efficiency. He reached into his jacket, pulling a sleek handgun from a hidden holster. Speak of the devil, he muttered. They're here. Try not to get killed, Lori. You're no use to the boss if you're dead before the fight begins. I stood frozen as the sound of shattering glass echoed from the foyer below. The crisis of trust was suddenly eclipsed by the terror of reality. The monsters were at the door, and I no longer knew if the man who held the key was my savior or my executioner. The sirens had been a test, a brutal drill orchestrated by Seung-Ho to see if I would crumble or climb. I hadn't crumbled. 2 weeks later, the bruises on my arm had faded to nothing, replaced by the weight of a silk gown the color of midnight. Tonight was the grand winter gala, a sea of champagne and shark-finned socialites where the city's power brokers met to trade secrets. As we stepped out of the limousine, the flashbulbs of the paparazzi felt like a firing squad. Seung-Ho didn't offer me his arm as a suggestion. He took my hand and tucked it firmly against his side. He looked devastating in a tuxedo, a king reclaiming his throne, but his eyes never stopped moving. "Stay close," he murmured, his breath warm against my ear. "In this room, a smile is just a way to show your teeth. Don't let them see you shrink." I nodded, my heart drumming a frantic rhythm. For years, Fermin had told me I was a social embarrassment, a girl who didn't know which fork to use or how to hold a conversation. But as we moved through the ballroom, I realized I had a skill these people lacked. I knew how to watch. I knew how to read the air for a change in temperature, a shift in posture, or a gaze that lingered a second too long. I was a survivor of the shadows, and the shadows were everywhere tonight. We moved to the balcony for air, away from the clinking crystal and the stifling scent of lilies. The city lights stretched out below us like fallen stars. Seung-Ho turned to me, his expression softening for a fraction of a second. "You're doing well, Lori. You look like you belong here." "I look like I belong to you," I corrected softly, though the sting of the words was gone. "Is that so bad?" He started to ask, but I wasn't listening anymore. A tiny, rhythmic flickering caught my eye. It wasn't a camera flash or a city light. On the roof of the opera house across the plaza, a single pinprick of crimson light danced across the stone railing. It moved with a terrifying, mechanical precision, crawling upward toward the lapel of Seung-Ho's jacket. I didn't think. I didn't wait for permission. My 5 years of hypervigilance, the same instinct that had kept me alive in a basement apartment, screamed in my ear. "Down!" I shrieked, lunging at him with my full weight. I slammed into his chest, the force of my momentum catching him off guard. We hit the marble floor just as a sharp crack echoed through the plaza, followed by the terrifying sound of stone shattering exactly where his head had been a second before. Seung-Ho rolled, pinning me beneath him to shield me with his own body, his hand already reaching for the concealed weapon beneath his coat. He looked down at me, his eyes wide with a shock I had never seen before. I had spotted the death meant for him before his own professional security had even blinked. "You saw it?" he breathed, the red laser now dancing harmlessly across the wall behind us. "I've spent my life looking for the hit before it lands. Seung-Ho," I whispered, my voice shaking but certain. The dragon wasn't the only one who knew how to hunt. The tires of the sedan screamed against the asphalt as we tore away from the gala, leaving the chaos of the plaza behind. But the escape was a hollow victory. The shadows I had spotted were not just one sniper, but an entire fleet. Black SUVs pursued us with a mechanical ruthlessness, boxing us in until the glittering lights of the city were replaced by the skeletal silhouettes of industrial cranes and the salt-heavy air of the shipping docks. The car was forced off the road, skidding into a narrow alleyway formed by towering walls of rusted steel containers. Before the engine could even cut, the world erupted in gunfire. Seung-Ho grabbed my hand, his grip like a vice, and hauled me out of the car. We ran through a maze of metal, the bullets pinging off the containers like lethal hail. "In here," he commanded, his voice tight with an urgency I'd never heard. He shoved aside the heavy latch of a half-open container, pulling me into the pitch-black interior before sliding the massive steel door shut with a resounding clang. The silence that followed was suffocating. The container was a kill box, a windowless tomb that smelled of damp wood and old grease. Outside, the sound of footsteps on gravel signaled the arrival of the Iron Lotus. They weren't rushing. They knew they had the dragon cornered. Seung-Ho pressed me against the back wall, his body acting as a shield in the dark. I could hear his labored breathing, a sharp contrast to the calm man who had bought a boutique just to see me smile. My hands went to his chest, feeling the sticky warmth spreading across his silk shirt. My heart stopped. "You're hit?" I whispered, the terror rising in my throat. "It's a graze," he lied, his voice straining. He reached into his waistband, pulling out a spare magazine and clicking it into his weapon. The sound was deafening in the small space. "Lori, listen to me. There is a small ventilation hatch at the floor level in the far corner. It's large enough for you to crawl through. When I start firing, you run. You head for the water and don't look back." "No," I said, the word coming out stronger than I expected. "I'm not leaving you. Lori, you are the bait they want," he growled, his hand finding my face in the dark. His thumb brushed my cheek, a final, desperate gesture of possession. "If you stay, we both die. If you go, I can make them pay for every inch of skin they took from you." I looked at the silhouette of the man who had bought my debt to save my life. Outside, a voice shouted in a language I didn't understand, followed by the heavy thud of a sledgehammer against the door. The steel groaned. The dragon was wounded, trapped in a box of his own making, and for the first time, I realized that being property meant I was the only thing worth fighting for. But I was tired of being the bait. I wanted to be the hunter. The metal walls of the container groaned as a second sledgehammer blow buckled the steel near the door. Dust and flakes of rust rained down on us in the dark. Seung-Ho was leaning more heavily against me now, his breathing shallow and jagged. The scent of copper was becoming overwhelming, a visceral reminder that the dragon was bleeding out in this steel tomb. "The hatch, Lori," he wheezed, his voice a ghost of its former command. He used his good arm to shove me toward the far corner, where a faint glimmer of moonlight peeked through a rusted ventilation grate at the floor level. "It leads to the drainage pipes under the pier. They won't see you crawl out. You go to the bridge, find Director Min. He has orders to take you to the safe house in Jeju." "I'm not leaving you to die," I sobbed, my fingers hooking into the lapels of his ruined tuxedo. Seung-Ho suddenly surged forward, pinning me against the wall one last time. His eyes were burning with a fierce, terminal intensity. "Listen to me. If they find you, they don't just kill you. They break you. They sell what's left of you." He pressed his forehead against mine, a desperate, final intimacy. "I didn't buy your life just to watch it end in a box. I bought you so you could finally be free. Now, take the space I gave you and run." With a strength fueled by pure adrenaline, he kicked the ventilation grate. It clattered away, revealing a dark, narrow hole leading into the damp void beneath the docks. He didn't wait for me to agree. He grabbed my waist and shoved me toward the opening, his movements frantic as the primary door hinges outside began to scream under the pressure of a crowbar. "Go!" he roared, turning back toward the door and raising his weapon with a trembling hand. "That's an order, Lori." I hit the cold, wet floorboards, the salt spray from the harbor stinging my eyes. I looked back at him, a silhouette of broken power, ready to hold the line against an army just to give me a few seconds of a head start. He was choosing to be the shield, to be the sacrifice, to let his own story end so mine could continue. I reached the hatch, my fingers gripping the jagged edges of the metal. But as I looked at the industrial control panel just outside the container, and the massive crane towering over the men currently breaching the door, A different kind of fire ignited in my chest. Fermin had taught me to run. Seung-Ho had taught me that I was worth fighting for. I didn't crawl into the drainage pipe. I crawled toward the shadows of the machinery. If Seung-Ho was ready to die for me, then I was finally ready to kill for him. The shadows of the dock were my sanctuary as I scrambled toward the towering shadow of the industrial crane. Inside the container, a rhythmic boom signaled that the Iron Lotus had finally breached the door. Gunfire erupted, short, desperate bursts from Seung-Ho, followed by the heavy, systematic chatter of automatic weapons. My heart screamed for me to run back, but I knew the only way to save the dragon was to become the fire. I climbed the iron ladder of the crane, my hands slick with grease and cold harbor water. The cabin was a glass-walled cage perched high above the kill box. I didn't know how to operate heavy machinery, but I knew how to survive. I looked at the controls, my eyes scanning the levers as Fermin's voice echoed in my head, telling me I was too stupid to learn, too weak to lead. I pushed his voice into the dark and grabbed the primary joystick. Below me, 3 men from the Iron Lotus were stepping into the container, their weapons leveled at the slumped figure of Seung-Ho. I threw the lever forward. The massive steel hook and the heavy magnetic plate attached to the crane swung with a tectonic groan. It caught the lead assassin squarely in the chest, hurling him into the dark water of the bay. Before the others could react, I dropped the magnetic plate onto the roof of the SUV they had used to block the car. I swung the arm of the crane, dragging the 2-ton vehicle like a toy across the concrete, crushing the remaining gunmen against the side of a container. The silence that followed was broken only by the lapping of waves and the distant hum of the city. I climbed down, my legs shaking so violently I nearly fell. I ran into the container, collapsing beside Seung-Ho. He was pale, his eyes fluttering, but he was alive. A week later, we stood on the balcony of the penthouse. Seung-Ho was dressed in a fresh charcoal suit, his shoulder bandaged but his stance as commanding as ever. He didn't offer a romantic speech or flowers. He reached into his pocket and produced a heavy black velvet box. Inside lay a ring, not a diamond, but a heavy gold band set with a flat black onyx stone bearing the intricate crest of a dragon. It was a signet ring, the symbol of the head of the Lee family. "I promise to protect you," he said, his voice rough with an emotion he usually kept buried. He took the ring and, to my shock, he didn't just hand it to me. He went down on one knee, not as a suitor, but as a king acknowledging a peer. "I was wrong, Lori. You don't just need protection. You need power." He slid the heavy ring onto my finger. It was a perfect fit. "You are not my guest, and you are certainly not my property," he vowed, looking up at me with burning intensity. "You are my equal, the queen of my empire." I looked at the black stone on my hand, then at the city below. I wasn't the trembling girl hiding in the floorboards anymore. I had stepped out of the car and into the light. I accepted the ring. I accepted the dragon. And for the first time in my life, I took up all the space I wanted.